in the meantime, while Trump is huffing and puffing, the Europeans are there right now in Kiev, offering money, further assistance, and continued support. And so, I think we're going to be in a world where the Europeans are going to protect Ukraine, however that's going to look. And if America decides to play all these games, they're not going to be involved.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've spoken to Sir Bill Browder about everything happening between the alliance between the United States and Russia, if you could call it that. We've got negotiation chats happening again tomorrow. He's spoken about those controversial comments from Donald Trump when he called President Zelensky a dictator. Zelensky had the ultimate comeback saying, look, he'll resign if he gets peace, if he gets Ukraine into NATO. So all of that, plus the relationship between Europe and the United States right now. We have Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron both traveling to Washington this week to meet with Trump to discuss the state of these were an alliance, was allies. We're not quite sure where we stand right now. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can tune into the Trump Report every day on Times Radio's YouTube page, or you can stream it as a podcast anywhere you get your podcasts. So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for your time today and for joining the Trump Report. Always good to have you on a Monday after a busy weekend of news. But over the weekend, Vladimir Putin launched 267 drones and 3 ballistic missiles towards Ukraine at a time where we're meant to be doing negotiations between these countries. This coupled with the fact that Donald Trump and Steve Witkoff last week said that from their interpretation when they've been interacting with Putin, he wants the fighting to stop. Now, does this look like a president that wants fighting to stop to you?
It absolutely does not. As I understand, this was the largest launch of any attack on Kiev since the start of the war. And so if you looked at it very objectively, one would say that that Putin wants to take advantage of the weakness that he sees coming from the United States, and to show his power by doing this type of thing. And it certainly isn't a move towards peace if that's the idea here.
And from your understanding, Bill, are Ukrainian troops still very much on the front line and prepared for anything that Putin is throwing their way? They're not sitting back and thinking that there's been a ceasefire at all.
No, of course not. I mean, there's no ceasefire. Every day, more than 1,000 Russian soldiers are killed. The war is going on in a very intensive way. And I should point out, one of the myths that the Russians and I guess the Trump administration has been trying to spread is that the UK or the Ukrainians are have given up. They're exhausted. They can't handle it anymore. They're ready to retreat. That's just not the case. Now, of course, they are exhausted. Everybody is exhausted, including the Russians. But the idea that the Ukrainians would prefer surrender, and by the way, what surrender means is Bucha. If anyone remembers Bucha, that was the town that the Russians took over near Kiev at the beginning of the war. And after it was liberated, we got to see the results of that occupation. And what we saw was women had been raped in front of their children. Men had had their hands tied behind their backs, tortured, and then shot and put in shallow graves, and then various children taken off to the far reaches, kidnapped to the far reaches of Russia. And so the Ukrainians may be exhausted, but they're not ready to give up and face a Bucha type of situation in the future.
And over the weekend, Bill, John Bolton said that Putin thinks that Trump is a useful idiot to him. Now, we've had all these drone attacks over the weekend. As you said, fighting is still very much ongoing. Do you see a world in which you have Donald Trump confront Vladimir Putin and say, enough is enough? You're meant to be negotiating a peace deal. We're meant to be getting to the end of this war, when in reality, he's still fighting. He's still got the blood on his hands over the weekend.
Well, if you listen to there was an interview with Steve Witkoff, the sort of newly emerged sort of most important person in this negotiation. This is Trump's special envoy for the Middle East, but he's involved in this. And the question was posed to him, you're asking for Ukraine to make all these concessions. What concessions are you asking Putin to make? And it was really painful to watch. He was just stuttering and stammering and bullshitting to try to avoid answering the question because they're not asking, the Trump administration is not asking Putin to make any concessions. And so he's asking Ukraine to capitulate, and he's not asking Putin anything in the hopes of some type of special deal for the United States. And that doesn't serve anyone's interests. I don't think it even serves the U.S. interest. It certainly doesn't serve the Ukrainians' interest, doesn't serve the European interest, and the vast majority of Americans are on the side of Ukraine, not on the side of Putin.
Yeah, we did see that. That was a very uncomfortable interview with Steve Witkoff saying that he didn't really have an answer to what Russia would basically be giving up. But we do have these negotiations kicking off for a second time on Tuesday, Bill, after the first negotiations started last week. Do you think that Russia will be adhering to any sort of concessions?
Well, it's clear that the U.S. isn't asking them to, and I wouldn't even call this a negotiation. What this looks like is a resetting of relations between the United States and Russia. There's no real negotiation. If you're not asking the Russians to do anything, that's not a negotiation, and that's what's going to happen on Tuesday. The other thing which is happening. So you have the United States speaking to Russia and saying you don't have to do anything. And by the way, let's start doing business together and open up embassies and have all sorts of restoration of bilateral relations. We're going to put you in the G7, so on and so forth. And then you have the United States going to Ukraine and say, we're not going to provide you with any security guarantees, but we want you to sign over all your natural resources or 50% of your natural resources into perpetuity to pay us back for military aid that we gave you, not as a loan, but as a grant. And if you don't do that, we're going to cut off Starlink and God knows what else we're going to do. I mean, it just doesn't sound to me like any sort of negotiation at all. It sounds like America is going in, having switched sides and making ultimatums to the Ukrainians and puffing up to Putin.
It is so bizarre to have this narrative flipped in just a matter of weeks, especially because at the time of the war breaking out, Elon Musk was very much praised for being quite heroic in providing Ukraine with Starlink at a time when they needed reception, they needed to be able to contact their loved ones. And now it's obviously flipped and it's been weaponized against them. But Bill, I want your thoughts on the fact that this cozying up to Putin, this is very bizarre and very quick. A lot of speculation is that Donald Trump wants this newfound alliance with Russia because it helps his rival with China. It makes China look like they're on the outside. It makes them look quite weak because we've got these two big nations now coming together. What are your thoughts on the fact that some experts believe that this is all just to say to China, hey, look, we're the big dogs now, you're not in it?
Well, that would be by far the most charitable way of characterizing what's happened, that there's actually some kind of grand plan here, that there's some type of strategy. And if there was, we would hear them, we would hear that. They would tell us that. I don't believe there is. I mean, basically what you have going on right now is China is aligned with Russia, Iran is aligned with Russia, and North Korea is aligned with Russia. And now the United States is joining this unholy alliance of evil countries. And what I find so unbelievable about this is that I don't think that this is in any way a popular thing to do in the United States. I know for sure that among Republicans in Congress, aside from a few nutcase wackos like Marjorie Taylor Greene, this is not not something that any of them would support. And I can say that the reason that they wouldn't support it is that the American people wouldn't support it. And so it's quite remarkable that Trump has decided to, in a matter of moments, switch sides to from the democracies, the free speech, the freedom countries, to the dictatorships, to the terrorists, and to the evil countries, and it just doesn't make any outside sense.
But do you think that what's in it for the US, Bill? What is in it to have this narrative completely flipped and him being cozying up to Putin and therefore cozying up to, yes, those evil countries?
Well, you ask a question which there is no answer. There is no reason. There's no national interest for the United States to do this, and so it's purely what's in it for Donald Trump. And I guess time will tell. But perhaps there's a business deal to be done, or perhaps there's some strange affinity that he wants to be a dictator and wants to be like Putin. Um, I don't know. That there was the whole Trump Russia investigation back in 2017. And of course, Robert Mueller put together a very detailed report showing all sorts of different links between the Trump campaign and Russia, and all sorts of links between Russia and the Trump campaign. They never found anything prosecutable, but maybe there and everyone, and that, of course, that was characterized as the Russia hoax. Anyone talking about it afterwards suffered from Trump derangement syndrome. But here we have um, uh, Donald Trump, completely prostrating himself in front of Vladimir Putin, and perhaps there's a lot more to that story than we thought.
Absolutely. Bill, I want to get into this $500 billion minerals contract that Donald Trump has sent President Zelensky. He's had it for, I think, over a week now. And it seems like Zelensky sent back a few negotiations because it was quite a bizarre thing to be sending a country in the middle of a war. How close do you think Zelensky is to signing this negotiation? And from your view, should he be taking it in the first place?
Well, let me answer the second question first. Of course not. It's ridiculous. The whole thing is completely absurd. You don't go to the victim of a war and ask them to pay war reparations to the United States. That's just crazy. Secondly, 500 billion number is some kind of made up number and total exaggeration that God knows where it comes from, but it has nothing to do with reality. The number is 100 billion. Thirdly, the money was given as a grant. It wasn't intended to be paid back. There's no reason why the Ukrainians should pay it back. And fourthly, and most importantly, this is just them asking, the Americans asking a poor, desperate, victimized country for money, and there's nothing in return for the Ukrainians. They're not going to get any guarantees of any sort. The United States isn't saying if you sign over, whatever, we're going to protect you from now on, and Russia will never touch you again. That's not happening. They're saying we want this for money that we gave you before that we now want you to pay back. Um, and by the way, why should the Ukrainians trust any agreement signed by the Americans when the Americans signed the Budapest Memorandum asking the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear weapons back in the 90s in exchange for protection, and that's never happened. And so I'm sure that Zelensky is not going to sign it, and nor should he sign it. And he's right to push back on it. And in the meantime, while Trump is huffing and puffing, the Europeans are there right now in Kiev, offering money, further assistance, and continued support. And so, I think we're going to be in a world where the Europeans are going to protect Ukraine, however that's going to look. And if America decides to play all these games, they're not going to be involved.
Well, what do you think about the state of the relationship between Europe and the US right now, Bill? It's created a lot of tension in the last few weeks. Do you see an alliance between Europe and the US dwindling off?
Well, if you listen to the statements of the new Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, he's basically saying that the NATO is going to be finished, and we can't expect any kind of military support from America. So we have to then, his main objective as Chancellor is now to create a European and German defense mechanism. I think that based on the speech that J.D. Vance gave in Munich, I think he pretty much told it how it is, that he doesn't see Russia as the enemy, he sees Europe as the enemy.
And if someone had told you that, 3 months ago, would you have believed that this was the state that the country the world would be in right now?
I think everybody is in a complete state of shock. I know I am. It's and I think Americans are. Most Americans I know are in a state of shock. This is not the country that they this the leadership uh, is not projecting their values, their decisions, and their preferences.
This week, Bill, Keir Starmer will be travelling to Washington for his own meeting with Donald Trump. Emmanuel Macron was also travelling on Tuesday for a meeting with Trump to discuss, I guess, the relationships that they've got with the US. How do you think the relationship between the UK, France, and the US will be after the meeting with Trump?
Well, it's impossible to say because it's all based on, how did he feel when he woke up that morning. Um, what I can say is a very fraught situation for both of these leaders. So Keir Starmer is going to go there, and on one hand, he's got to try to convince Trump, to grow a backbone when it comes to Putin and to support Ukraine. But depending on how invested Trump is in his position, if Keir Starmer comes on too strong, then the consequence is that Trump could threaten Britain with 25% tariffs, as he has. Um, However, if Keir Starmer comes on too weak, and he looks like he's sort of pandering to a dictator, he's going to come back to Britain, and the people here are not going to be very happy with him for selling out Ukraine or to in any way compromise our values and our position. And so um, it's kind of almost a no-win situation, but hopefully, he'll be able to pull a rabbit out of a hat. And if he does, this will be a great um, a great endorsement of his leadership if he can somehow um, uh, you know thread this needle.
Well, recently Keir Starmer announced UK sanctions on Russia. Obviously, a very important way to be hitting Russia where it hurts. Do you think that Donald Trump needs to stop focusing so much on this relationship with Putin and be trying to bankrupt him, as we previously thought was going to be, the war method that the US was using?
Well, that's the obvious thing to do. So, what the U.S. should be doing in a perfect scenario is doubling down on military aid for Ukraine and doubling down on economic isolation of Russia through sanctions and other means. And of course, confiscating the Russian $300 billion of central bank reserves that are held offshore. That's what the West, that's what America should be doing. And that's what that was one of the scenarios that we were looking for. And I can remember the first few days after Trump was inaugurated, he made some very strong statements saying that, Putin doesn't negotiate. There's going to be tariffs, taxes, and sanctions. And then all of a sudden he switched. And but I guess the one, saving grace from this whole thing is how quickly he switched. He could probably switch back again. So, it's not a totally lost cause, but it's terribly frightening for anyone who cares about Ukraine.
But it seems, Bill, and this is a question I've asked quite a number of my guests on the Trump Report in the last few weeks, it does seem like the way that Donald Trump is negotiating and his decision to be leaving not only Ukraine but Europe out on the table of talks all comes down to his ego. Do you think it's about his ego? He wants to be the one person in the world that brokers a deal with the biggest dictator right now.
Well, I think it's about ego for sure, but I think it's slightly different. I think that he doesn't respect institutions. He likes doing deals with people, and he doesn't. He wants to talk to He wants to talk to Putin because they can talk to each other and make a deal. And he doesn't like all this sort of EU, many countries, institutions, all this kind of stuff because that's not deal making. He can't sort of go into a quiet room and cut a deal. And so I think the main reason why he doesn't want Europe at the table is he just wants to be in a room with Putin and have Putin respect him and cut a deal. Now, why Ukraine is not involved is completely perplexing because in order to do a deal, in order to make a ceasefire happen, in order to create a peace, you need to have the warring party, Russia, and the defending party, Ukraine, in the same room. And the fact that they're not makes no sense at all.
Bill, late last week, the big story was Donald Trump's insane, controversial comments where he called President Zelensky a dictator, said that he needs to hold an election right now to basically prove that Ukrainians want him in power, despite the fact that Ukraine is currently under martial law, as it's obviously in a war-torn country right now. Despite even that, the fact that an election is obviously quite costly for a country to even be running in the first place. What were your thoughts on those comments?
Well, I thought it was completely Orwellian, that George Orwell, 1984, black is white, white is black, up is down, down is up. Putin is the dictator. Zelensky is a democratically elected leader of his country, desperately trying to hold it all together. But what I thought was most interesting was that Zelensky had the perfect comeback this weekend. He said, "I'll resign as long as as long as Ukraine is properly protected. I'll resign if Ukraine is let into NATO." And that kind of completely destroys this misinformation that Trump is throwing around, that Zelensky is a dictator. Dictators don't offer to resign. So I don't know what Trump is going to do with that, but that kind of throws that completely on his face.
Just a final question for you, Bill. Today is the 3-year anniversary of when Russian troops officially descended on Ukraine, sparking this war that has now been going on for 3 years. I don't think anyone really thought that this would last 3 years. But my question is, how do you think Vladimir Putin is feeling right now? Do you think he feels like he's got the upper hand in this war, or do you think he's completely inundated by the stress of it all, especially the economic stress?
Well, I think if you had asked Vladimir Putin 3 weeks ago or a month ago how he felt, he would be on the edge of his wits. He would be completely strung out from this whole thing. He's just losing so many people, and the economy is suffering so badly, and he didn't know how he was going to replenish the troops without a general conscription, which would be horribly unpopular, which might be the thing that ruins his dictatorship. Interest rates were at 23%. I mean, a lot of stuff was really going wrong for him, and I think he would have been really very worried. But then all of a sudden, out of thin air, there's this unbelievable gift from God, better than anything he could ever hope for in his wildest, most optimistic dreams, which is the enemy, the United States of America, the country that had ruined the Soviet Union, all of a sudden, giving him a helping hand, aligning with him, telling him everything's going to be okay, and then sort of ganging up with him on this little victim, Ukraine. I mean, I don't think he could have imagined such good fortune as he has right now.
It's a wait and watch situation, Bill, and we'll probably speak to you later in the week when these negotiations, or lack of negotiations, as you put it, will kick off tomorrow. But thank you for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.